there's kind of different stages of the revolution. A lot of people, when they think back on the revolution, they think of British superiority in terms of numbers and equipment and training. But at this point, the British are severely outnumbered. Um, there's only a couple thousand of them in Boston. Like you said, they're raising 17,000, 18,000 militiamen. At this stage and during the outbreak of the revolution, they're severely outnumbered, but they're conducting these powder raids. And one of the interesting things is it seems that the rebels, the colonists, the militia, they were always one step ahead. Um, it sort of seems that there was a spy ring. There was a lot of quick communication. So, what was the scene there? Were there spies in the midst of the British? How were the rebels always one step ahead in terms of knowing that the British were coming?
Well, as I know, as I alluded to in the novel, again, it's a novel; it's totally fictional. That there are a lot of people that have accused Margaret Gates of being one of these spies. That because she was the governor's wife. But she was also an American. She's American born, and that she may have been a spy. There was another guy named Church who was we know for a fact was a spy. We don't actually know Gates was a spy. In fact, I read a really good art. Margaret Gates was a spy. I read a really good article that said it pointed out that the Americans had plenty of reason to know that they were preparing for another raid. They knew that the British were trying to fix their longboats so they could take the boats across the river, and they were training. They had taken the grenadiers and the light infantry off guard duties so that they could rest. There were a lot of indications, as the article argued, and I totally agree that all that happened. But people don't always see it, and having somebody confirm it from the inside is helps a lot. So yeah, there was lots of American spies, and Americans could just see what was going on. So again, and the American elite, the gentry such as Joseph Warren, were friends and had regularly had dinner with some of the senior British officers. So there was lots of ways for information to get passed, and I don't think they had what we call OPSEC in modern Army, operational security, because you don't talk about things. I don't think they had a good concept of operational security in the British Army at that time.
For sure. Is this sort of the beginning stages of the Culper spy ring? Is this related whatsoever?
Not that I know of. I'm actually not that familiar with the Culper spy ring. I know of it, but I don't know the origins of it or what stage it came involved. A lot of these things came out kind of afterwards, but I don't know. I'm talking beyond my personal knowledge.
Yeah, it's probably still very foggy because at this time they're still writing everything on parchment, documentation,
And just word of
naturally,
mouth,
um,
not writing it down. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And spy business tends to be a little secretive, so it's probably difficult to discover what they were doing in hindsight. But when it comes to Lexington and Concord, one of the most infamous stories, it's been sort of romanticized and mythologized throughout American history, and that is Paul Revere. And you allude to him in the story a little bit, but what was his role in this story? Because Governor Gage is
Yeah, I've been saying
he's
Gates. Gage, you're right. Sorry.
yeah, yeah, yeah. He's conducting this mission now, another powder raid. He wants to go all the way to Concord, because they hear there's a big um colonist arsenal, militia arsenal there with cannons and guns and whatnot. So he's conducting this mission, and Paul Revere does his infamous midnight ride. So what exactly is Paul Revere's role in this?
So Paul Revere, in the small scale here, was an acolyte of Joseph Warren, who was very prominent among the founding fathers. A lot of people have argued he would have been one of the more famous founding fathers had he survived the Battle of Bunker Hill. But anyway, he didn't. But he was in Boston. He had a personal relationship of some kind with Margaret Gage, say it correctly this time. He knew a lot of the British officers, a lot of the senior ones. For example, I substituted fictional characters for some of the real people. One of the real people was Earl Hugh Percy, who was the British officer in charge of the relief that went in and saved the original raiding party. They had personal Joseph Warren and Gage had personal relationship. But anyway, Joseph Warren was a prominent guy. He had a lot of guys working for him, or working with him, and Paul Revere was one of them. Paul Revere and another gentleman whose name slips my mind. Unfortunately, slips history, because I think he's the only one that got to Concord. Because when Paul Revere and this other guy went out Warren sent them out to warn the countryside that the British were coming. Paul Revere was actually captured near Lexington, and did not get, but he did alert the countryside and a lot of people out. And what the way it was kind of you go to this town and alert them, and then they send out riders, and they go out all over the countryside. So the whole by the morning time, all of Massachusetts and parts of Connecticut and elsewhere would have been alerted. But that's exactly what it was. And then Paul Revere, as I said, was captured and was had his own story, and eventually ended up having to walk home because they didn't do anything to him other than to cut the saddle off his horse, so he had to walk home or ride bareback home.
Yeah, one of the things that the British were hoping for was this element of surprise when conducting their powder raid to Concord, which crashed and burned because of these midnight riders and the speedy communication and spy rings and all that. So what was the plan that Governor Gage devised to to conduct this powder raid to Concord? Because from my understanding, Concord was pretty far away from Boston. This was sort of the furthest powder raid they were conducting. It was a pretty big operation for the circumstances. So, what exactly is his plan? I know obviously a big element of that is surprise.
Yes, yes, of course. It goes to Gage's plan was evolved from the last one that had happened. That was the raid on Salem that had been unsuccessful, or near Salem. I'm trying to remember the name of the town now. But they had gone by sea. A ship had taken a regiment, I believe it was the 64th Regiment, to this island. And then one of the reasons Gage was worried about the bridges at Concord is because the colonists had raised the drawbridge and didn't allow the British soldiers to get to where they were storing their weapons. Until they had spirited them away, and then so the British went home empty-handed. So what Gage wanted them to do was get to Concord before the Americans were alarmed, because he knew there was some sort of alarm system, but he didn't think it was sophisticated enough to oppose his raiding party. He picked at that time the British Army was organized and had 10 companies. Each regiment was the basic unit. Each regiment had 10 companies, include 8 regular line companies, and then a grenadier company, which was supposed to be taller, stronger guys, and then a light infantry company was supposed to be quicker, faster guys. And so what he did was gather all the what they call flanker companies, and put them in 2 battalions: a grenadier battalion and a light infantry battalion. And so that he would have the elite of the British Army in Boston would go on this raid, march overnight, destroy the arms, and then return back. A couple of flaws in the plan. What they did have some officers go and recon the route beforehand, but they didn't. The British Army did not have a good feeling. They had rarely been outside of Boston since the troubles had started. And they didn't have a good grasp on what was going on. Obviously, the colonists did. And then they didn't understand the alarm system. They didn't know how many for sure were going to go on. They didn't know. One of the big faults they didn't know was that one of the places that when the alarm went out, where all the American militia regiments were supposed to meet, was Concord, which is right. So they were going right into the mouth of the enemy. So the plan, and then he kept it a secret from everybody, clear up until literally the night before. What happens is everybody knew about it except the British soldiers that were trying to execute the plan. It was a big problem for them, and that's one of the things I found so fascinating about the story is these guys, they were told at 8 o'clock in the evening, "Hey, you got to march to Concord tonight," and destroy all the arms and march back before the American militia, which is 4 times as big as you, is going to come out uh, before their turnout, as they say. So yeah, that was the plan. March there, destroy the arms, and march back before the Americans can come out.
Yeah, speaking of that drawbridge you mentioned, it was an interesting little anecdote from the novel. One of the guys who was at that raid, that unsuccessful raid, he mentioned kind of offhand that if it wasn't for this drawbridge, the revolution would have started there. Because the only reason the British weren't able to pursue this plan was because they got quelled by this drawbridge. But if that was down, there probably would have been an armed conflict there. But yeah, this operation seems to have been very poorly planned. They didn't alert them until late at night that they're marching to Concord. A lot of the guys were drinking. I don't know if that was just a dramatization for the novel, but a lot of them are drunk in bed and they have to get awoken. I mean, you can imagine how miserable that would be if you're sort of half drunk, half hungover, and you have to march 20 miles to Concord to do this powder raid.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. One they do that I don't know. Have you been to Boston before on Patriot Day? Well, on Patriot Day, that's it's a celebration of the raid on Concord and the start of the Revolutionary War, and that's the Boston Marathon too at the same time, and so it's kind of significant that because for the British that was more than a marathon. They had to go 17 miles each way, carrying muskets and all their accoutrements. So it was very strenuous marching. And having marched overnight before, I can tell you it gets rough after a while.